So, Tim, you are my very special guest for today's SFT podcast. I don't need to introduce you, but you're founder of the Eden Project and also previously the Lost Gardens of Heligan and much more. Thank you for agreeing to talk to me this morning.
Oh, it's my pleasure. You're one of the favorite people on the whole planet, and you're talking from one of my favorite places. I can see on this call that it's like a dream office you are in, with a piano, papers scattered around to make you look suitably eccentric, British and intelligent, and books lining all the walls. It's just marvelous.
Well, that's very nice. All I can see is your ceiling, but it's a Cornish ceiling.
My dear fellow, I can't see myself. It is a Cornish ceiling. The weather makes seeing anything else a little bit of a challenge. But
I was going to ask you that because it rained all night here.
yeah, well, the River Foy burst its banks last night down here. It was flowing absolutely fit to bust, and it did in Lostwithiel. So
Wow.
I'm hoping that the town hasn't been damaged too much, but the picnic area next to the old sheep drovers bridge that you will remember from the middle of Lostwithiel, the picnic area next to it, the tables got swept away.
Blimey. Did you know this? That for every 1 degree centigrade that the Earth's atmosphere warms, it can absorb 7% more moisture, which is why in the last 10 years or whatever it is, I think it's 10 years, we're going to on average 10% more rain in the winter. It more goes up into the atmosphere in the summer and 10% more now comes down in the winter, which completely explains why it's getting wetter in winter. And it sounds so simple, but I didn't kind of fully get that until the other day when somebody said it. So we are definitely experiencing this. We're getting drier summers when it rains here in West Wales. Somebody once said to me, when it rains in Wales, there's 1.5 times as much rain and 1.5 times as long, but now that's amplified by 10%. And I suspect it's close to that with you in Cornwall as well.
Well, it's funny. I was driving with Charlotte the other day across Bodmin Moor, and we were reflecting on the fact that, for reasons that I can't recall, that we called ourselves Homo sapiens. In fact, Homo sapiens sapiens, so wise we named ourselves twice. But how wise are we being? This is a question, not a statement. This isn't me being, rhetorical. That it would seem if we were really wise, we ought to now extrapolate forward 50, 100 years in terms of what we think our water demands are going to be, and create the infrastructure as if we were there now, so that we can create systems to filter water slowly and so on. Because I remember actually at Bilthgwern with you, there was someone talking, I think it was your marvelous friend from Egypt, who was talking about...
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah, and he was talking about the unintelligent way that we weren't in places where there was moisture. We were taking it so much for granted that we weren't building protection against, because we just couldn't imagine not being with water, so that we weren't protecting ourselves properly. I mean, obviously, we build reservoirs for drinking water and all that sort of stuff, but actually in agriculture, I'd be really interested in your views about this, because there are going to be huge changes in agriculture, which I hope you'll talk about. But within that, you've got two things going on: a disrespect culturally for water, allied to a cultural disrespect for farming and horticulture, which has its history in a mixture of a changed consumer society, but also in the rather bizarre fact that refrigeration only became available more widely in the 1950s, early 1950s. I didn't know that. I checked this because you know, as well as I do from our youth, that April was often referred to as the hungry month or the dying month, depending on the poor quality of your horticulture. And as soon as there was refrigeration, the brilliant, degree-level talents of horticulturists and agronomists across the country were suddenly rendered pointless, or apparently pointless, because you could save everything and import things from other places. And it's led to it's a cliche to use the phrase a perfect storm, but actually I think it's an appropriate metaphor where you have a situation of cultural disrespect for farming and horticulture and complete blindness to where the fundamental elements that sustain our life come from. And you've just illustrated that, because, I mean, if we are poor husbanders of water, by Jove, we will be in such trouble. Discuss.
Yes, well, it's interesting you bring up Helmi Abeles from Sekhem, because he and I are great friends, and I've been there to his place, which is thousands of acres of reclaimed desert, irrigated only by Nile water, but because he's using a composting system to prime the fertility of the soil, he uses 40% less Nile water than conventional agriculture does. And I've always thought it's really strange that I'm in the opposite, we're in the opposite end of the spectrum here. We've got too much, he's got too little. But in a way, we're all in it together. And how we can manage water too much or too little and still produce good food is the kind of question of our time. And we're in the thick of it here, trying to work that out. And just to go back to your point about refrigeration. It's funny, I never thought of this, but we used to stay in the 50s with my grandparents, who in their retirement, because he was a missionary in India, had a parish in Colchester, and they had an Elizabethan farmhouse. They didn't have a fridge, and I hadn't thought about that until today. So this is sort of 1955. They had a larder with a sort of gauze cupboard thing in it called the pendula. I've no idea why it was called that, but that was where all the stuff was kept, instead of a fridge. That was the 50s. So that was exactly your point. We didn't have refrigeration then. Well, not.
I was completely shocked. I only looked it up, to be honest, because I suddenly realized I kept talking about this dying month, and I knew, just like you do, about ice houses and all that sort of stuff. I tell you where the thought came from. It's the marvelous writer Patrick Gale. And Patrick had written a novel about a relative of his that had gone to Canada to work in an ice cutting company where they were cutting Arctic ice and putting it into boats and taking it to Europe. And I thought, when I was being told about this, I thought, that's fantastical. That still had been happening at the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s. Blimey, it was. It was a really big thing, the export of ice.
So now, are we going, because we're growing carrots, as you know, we've already harvested an acre. Now the weather's going to get cold and it may freeze. So we could harvest them all and put them in a cold store, which is one way forward, which is a huge refrigeration thing. Or we could try to insulate the field where the carrots are still growing, the acre that's left, with enough fleece or straw or a combination thereof to stop us having to refrigerate them and avoid the April hungry, whatever it's called, dead gap thing.
Yeah.
But we're making this up as we go along. And because everything's been so centralized and, made impossible for small family farms to work with, we're having to reinvent a food system which doesn't over depend on technology and, central stuff. So it's rather fascinating.
It is. I mean, the thing that it's very funny when we'll come on to this later, I hope, about how ideas sort of exchange between people and no one questions them. So a myth that is actually a very old story that was wrong, because depending on the seniority or reputation of the person who's perpetrating that myth or promoting it again, there was a very famous story which I'm sure you read in Stephen Jay Gould's book, Bully for Brontosaurus, where he was talking about a very famous paleontologist in the middle 1800s talking about this skeleton of a horse. I can't remember what it's called, but it's the most popular skeletal horse ever. And it was described as being like a very, very small hippo or donkey or something like that. And Stephen Jay Gould, just out of curiosity, looked it up and from the actual record and discovered it's a bloody great thing. And this thing about the dying month, what I hadn't realized was the skill of horticulturists to decide on a menu of things to grow, which could not be totally dependent on lifestyle choices and flavor. They also needed to take account of the growing habit and seasonality and the storage qualities and everything else. I mean, like, we grow 20 odd different types of apple. And one of the apples that we grow the name escapes me for a moment, but the purpose of it doesn't taste very good, actually. It tastes a bit floury. But the purpose of it is you can store it in the dark from about October right the way through to April. So what you're getting is just a tiny bit of sweetness, but it's surviving through the year and gives you that. And there are a lot of things like that which were put in clamps and things that were forced. And all of these skills are being lost to us because they're perceived as being quaint. And I think one of the things about your charity, which is hugely important, is to surface some of these things and thought processes, a bit like that extraordinary book that I know you've read called The Knowledge by Lewis Dartnell, which is about, it was the end of the world yesterday. What should we have been taught at school to make us survive?
Well, I haven't read that book. I should read it now, though.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely fabulous in terms of stimulating your mind. I mean, what on earth is it that made us think that a great education system would make you learn the kings and queens of England, but not how to grow something? I mean,
Well,
it's preposterous.
I'm glad you raised what you're doing with apples, because I'd like to, and the relationship between what you're doing and what we are doing with the SFT in here, because I'd like to explore that more. But I think for mere formality's sake, I think we should just go back and explore something a bit more personal about us. Can you remember where we first met? Because I think it was after the launch of the Eden Project. But I've got a story to tell, both about that, but also about my connection with your wife, Charlotte, who you already mentioned. So when did we meet?
Well, I can't recall. I know that it was probably 2000 to 2001. It was early on, and I don't want to flatter you because you hate being flattered, I know. But meeting you was a great thing because you had always been a name I was familiar with that stood for things that I agreed with, and you had a gravitas about the subject, which I felt impressively was apolitical, which was something that was hugely important because nobody likes being shouted at and told they're an idiot. At the same time, one of the ways that culturally we dismiss people is to other them by implying that they're a bit bohemian, they're a bit this, they're a bit that, and the other. And I think you and I have talked about the absolute need that something that is so important. I mean, you could say that the work you're in is existential. Therefore, it is really important that the knowledge that you surface is perceived to belong to everybody for the human race, not to be a narrow cul-de-sac for just a few people who wear kaftans.
I think the challenge we're facing is existential, and it's so important that you say that.
Well, thank you. And I think you and I have always been fellow travelers in all that. So that's when we met.
You might have heard of me, but I'd heard of you as well. And when it really crossed my radar screen was that when I was at the Soil Association in the run up to the millennium, there was a thing called the Millennium Commission. And actually a member of the Soil Association at the time contacted me and said, have you thought of putting in an application for a grant from the Millennium Commission? So I hadn't, but it was a good idea. So we did. And we came up with this idea of Millennium Farms. So as you know about this, as I'm about to get to, we put together this booklet thing, which had endorsements from God knows who. And the idea was to create a network of farms as educational stages using certified organic farms as the membership and getting them all to put in facilities so that they could welcome visitors. And I think the amount we put in for was about 10 million. And we were awaiting the decision of the Millennium Commission with bated breath. And then we heard that this man called Tim Smit had got the money, 30 million, I believe. And obviously we were disappointed. But of course, we were full of admiration for you. And that's when you really hit my radar screen. But somebody told me 2 days ago in London, I was just at a meeting in London. I said, I'm going to be talking to Tim on a podcast. And he said, oh, that's very interesting, because I heard that what happened was the Millennium Commission turned you down, but then you did something, you got a lot of publicity, and then they put you on again. Is that right?
Well, it's funny. I once told this story and someone wrote a letter to the Times complaining that I was morally turpitudinous and that I had lied, and that how on earth could I have been honoured by the Queen and all of that sort of stuff. So Angry of Tunbridge Wells was actually they were angry because they thought I had lied, but actually I had deliberately not lied. I just hadn't told the whole truth, and that not telling the whole truth became a future truth. What happened was we got a fact which told us we hadn't been shortlisted. I'd actually bought a fax machine just to be informed by the Millennium Commission of the outcome, and there was section A meant you had been given the money. B was it's quite a promising idea, but it needs work. And C was never darken our door again. You're obviously a maniac. And
Well, we got C, I think.
did you?
Dear John C.
Yeah, well, so did we. So did we. So I just, well, as you know, with any big project, in order to have a project, you've got to have persuaded lots and lots and lots of people to put in hard work for nothing and money as well, but it's a lot of work. And I just couldn't face the idea of telling probably over 100 people, many of whom had left their jobs to join us, that it was all over. And Jonathan Ball and I, Jonathan's co-founder of Eden, we just didn't know what to do. So we thought, well, in for a penny, in for a pound, people were going to be asking questions and it would be in the press and all the rest of it. So it was kind of a spoof, really. We put up our little tent at Heligan, borrowed some champagne and some flutes from the co-op in Mevagissey, and we invited all the press. And the only thing I actually said, this is true, the only thing I said was, I'd love to raise a glass and thank the Millennium Commission. I never said we'd been given a grant or anything. I never said anything. And what happened was, the following day or the day after, one of the national newspapers had an editorial which said, wasn't it refreshing to see that the institution set up to support things which otherwise would never get financed had the foresight to award a grant to something that was actually celebrating something for which Britain was truly synonymous with being a world leader. After which, everybody congratulated the Millennium Commission for their foresight. And again, there was never a conversation after that. Never. It was as if, I'm terribly sorry, that fax was sent out by error. And before we knew it, the paperwork was being put in place. And it's very difficult to tell the story because I think it's funny. And it's often used to say, well, that shows you the spirit of a true entrepreneur. Never say die, risk-taking, swashbuckling. The truth is a little bit milder than that. It was just to do with the terrible fear of having to say no to so many marvelous people. And I'm delighted, actually, and I don't think it speaks badly of anybody, really. And going back to Millennium Farms, which I'd like to, for the purpose of this discussion, I am often asked, what would I change in this country? And like you, I've become aware over the last, for cash, let's call it 20 years, it's not an exact thing, of the amount of young people who have started to develop an interest in agriculture and horticulture. The vibe about horticulture and agriculture is that it is a land for old people, but that's predominantly because farmers, the average age of farmers and farm owners is very high, and we haven't got in place great training facilities, access to capital, or anything else. So you're going to talk about Charlotte in a minute, but Charlotte's children are passionate growers, and you meet their friends and they're passionate growers, and you suddenly realize that one of the things that really needs to happen is to do what you were suggesting all those years ago. The Millennium Commission, rather the National Lottery, forgive me if I'm slightly off, but it's got somewhere between £600 and £700 million a year coming in for various projects of civic good, community well-being, and so on. Much of it, of course, is going to be well spent on things that would otherwise not get money, but a significant amount of it, to be honest, is funding things that people weren't that excited about, but there was no big vision of a horizon. And I would suggest that one of the greatest investments as an island nation that we could make would be to use on a regular annual basis that money to purchase land from the big landowners to be held in some clever way that I haven't thought about, but you, I'm sure, will have done, that enables young people to get on the land and have a step, to make a step change in terms of the whole vibe of agriculture. Because, so I'm quoting you back at you, so you're probably going to roll your eyes at me, but one of the problems we face is that farms are called farms, by which I mean the word farm comes with quite a lot of baggage to do with children's books, and there's always a little red tractor and a cat in the window and a sheepdog and a chicken that doesn't know what's coming, and farms, as you described with Millennium Farms, have the potential to be huge social hubs. They're places of emotional, intellectual, mental resetting. Let's call it resetting. Places where wildlife can be encouraged to live in harmony with the growing of food, but also places where people can come to learn how to grow stuff, to learn how to cook stuff, to learn how to preserve stuff, and in so doing meet loads of people and not be lonely and develop a whole bunch of life skills. And a great friend of yours who I met through you, Dorina Allen from Ballymaloe, is such... I know Ballymaloe is now a byword for, wealthy people learning how to cook, but by Jove, there is a woman who has transformed a nation into realizing that the cooking of food and the breaking of bread is not something that is marvelous when you read about it in the Bible or old world books. It's actually very, very real. One of the great joys of coming up to Bilthgwernan is to see that it's not hippie shit to cook together and to talk about growing things and to teach people to make. I mean, Dorina Allen's 30-minute lesson in how to make the best soda bread in the world has to be, I bet, now I'm an older man, it's as exciting as going to the Folies Bergère. It's absolutely cracking. And I wish every single living person in the UK, well, everywhere, but let's keep it to the UK, could have that thrilling experience of transforming a whole bunch of ingredients that looked inert and made you feel mute and stupid, transforming them into something that is burgeoning with life and that is catalytic in its ability to engage smiles and conversation and the sheer joy of, I made this. And if you can get people to realize that therein lies happiness, I think you could actually be really revolutionary. So we were talking about Millennium Farms and your idea to get people back on the land. And I think your narrative, which you voice many, many times about health, well-being for nature and for human beings, within that whole thing, that cultural weight is so powerful. And it shouldn't be fringe. It should be right at the core of our education system. And to be honest, over a glass of wine, I do not know a single living person that I have met that does not agree with you. Not one. However, when they put on suits and go and do politics and all the rest of it, they fall into the rubbish of wanting to create education systems like the ones that were inflicted on them. I just don't understand it. It's like, what do you call it? It's like a form of PTSD, isn't it? It's a weird PTSD. We must inflict on our children the education that nearly ruined us, and it's taken us a lifetime to get over it. But we'll do it to them. They deserve it.
Well, I'd like to bottle what you've just shared because it's so dense with stuff I want to respond to that I think I need to go and study it. I'll see if I can get it printed out somewhere. But I think one of the things which, apart from the fact that you got the cash and we didn't, I think that says everything about you. And I mean that in a flattering way because you weren't prepared to accept defeat. And I think you're absolutely right that the Millennium Commission were embarrassed, rightly, to change their minds and pretend they had never sent you that fax. And thank God that happened. And now, all these years later, 25 years later, maybe we can collaborate out of the conversation we're having right now on making Millennium Farms, we're calling it Beacon Farms now. I think there's so much potential in that. And you're right that the lottery could fund this, and I hope they will, because they should, because farms as educational stages to get millions of people having seeing is believing experiences and, as you say, having wonderful conversations and learning how to make Dorina Allen's breads and everything else. I mean, that's what we need to do. And we could lead the world with this. So I think that's just one thing that we can take from this conversation already.
Brilliant. I love that. if I might interject, it is our 25th birthday on March the 17th next year. And sadly, yesterday, I was in London at the memorial service speaking about the wonderful Nick Grimshaw, Sir Nick Grimshaw. And one of the things I said at the memorial service, I pretended that I'd written him a letter. And I said, Nick, the thing you need to know is that Eden does surveys almost every year about how people feel about being there. And the number one sentiment that people feel is optimistic. And a headmaster some time back said to me, Tim, Eden is really an extraordinary place because when I bring children here, it's as if for the first time some of them feel they've been given permission to dream. And I said at the memorial service, I said, Nick, what an epitaph that you gave people permission to dream. It's the sort of epitaph that you'd normally give to Peter Pan. And isn't that marvelous? I think, yeah, what your business is.
He was on Last Words on Radio 4 recently, wasn't he? I listened to that.
What you mean his memorial was?
No.
Died in September.
I think on Last Words, which is the obituary program on Radio 4, he was on it. Or not, he wasn't on it, but in fact his voice was on it, and I heard that. And in the program was the whole thing about his contribution to Eden. So how lovely you said that.
Well, holding that thought, the thing about permission to dream, right? We do live in a country which, for reasons that I don't understand, considering how much wonderful stuff there is, defaults to the negative. No is a more common answer than yes. And we've created a political culture of snidiness, which is bolstered by a kind of weird social media, which makes hope or optimism almost something to be derided. What makes you think that you should get above your station, Sonny Jim? Get back where you belong. And I think there's a book which you may have read when you were a little younger.
Well on your book list so far. I haven't read that one either.
No, well, the book is, to be honest, a little bit tedious, but when I say tedious, it's an anthropologist writing about a tribe in the mountains of Uganda called the Ik, spelled I-K, which became a famous play in the late 1970s. And it was about a tribe that fell out of love with being human. And they were so dissolute that if a child was crawling towards an open fire, they'd all just laugh. And I fear that if we only tell stories of negativity, we will stop dreaming, and yet this rich and fertile country of ours is able to not only harbour those that currently live here. I actually believe, with the intelligences of the people we all know, that it's capable of harbouring more and of being an example of the best practice in so many things. So why do we not allow the dreaming of what a great future might look like? I mean, I was talking with Andrew Wally, who's the chairman of Grimshaw, and he had learnt at the Glasgow School of Arts. And the Glasgow School of Arts have got a project in Forres, south, I think it's just south of Inverness. And they've got a whole team looking at the Highlands of Scotland, which we've romanticised. Lord knows how hunting, shooting, fishing managed to romanticize the wholesale destruction of a landscape and say that just heather was all you needed. But you could transform the entire Highlands. You could leave some romantic highlands for the deer if you wish, but you could, with the skills that we currently have, probably house several million people with livelihoods in the Highlands of Scotland. The same would be true.
I mean, I know about the Highland clearances in two ways. Firstly, because my father in 1966 purchased a ruined croft house on the west side of Skye. Since then, I've fallen in love with the Highlands and Islands and have been going up there ever since. And what is really interesting about the history of the West Highlands and Islands before the Highland clearances is that there were large populations there, and you can see the evidence of that with what's called lazy beds. Have you heard of lazy beds?
No, go on.
Basically raised beds where the people who lived in those places kind of dug it's like, well, literally, like they made raised beds to grow potatoes and they fertilized them with seaweed. And if you look at the West Highlands and Islands from the air, you can see the evidence of these lazy beds. And Lady Balfour, the founder of the Soil Association, she went to Barra and wrote about it actually, where they were still subsisting on really good, healthy food. She went there in the 50s. And it's extraordinary to see how few people now are nourished by that part of the world compared to how many used to be, even though you could say,
Yeah.
if you pejorative about it, oh, well, they were living a subsistence, hand to mouth living, barely surviving, and all that kind of thing. And they were liberated by the clearers who put the sheep on the land to go to wherever they went to, Nova Scotia and all these other places. But in
Well,
fact,
that's bollocks, isn't it? Sorry, that's
it's
rubbish.
definitely partially bollocks, because when I first started going up there, I was a hippie in those days, in the 60s. A group of us used to go and, camp out in our croft house for a week or two in the summer. And there was a couple who were in Glendale called Norman and Morag McCaskill, and they were still growing oats. And they had a house car. They made crowdy, soured cream cheese from the milk. And they welcomed us, even though we must have looked totally weird to them. And they'd never even left Glendale. And they were living still then in the 1960s, a self-sufficient life on a croft in Glendale. And I think there's so much that can teach us. And it's the question, I think, is whether that just is another piece of romantic crap that no people are going to take seriously, or whether actually, because of the point you made earlier about the existential nature of the challenge we face, that we find a way to build, to recreate, but not just rebuild as if it was, a replica of the past, but new, resilient, self-sufficient food systems which actually function well and prepare us for what's coming towards us quite fast, which, if we're not careful, is going to be, a very, very challenging time. And I think that the antidote to the existential challenge is actually built upon food security and
Yeah.
relocalization of our food systems. And we can learn from so many people who've been there before, like in Romania. I've been going to Romania quite a lot in the last 20 years, and they're still in the Transylvanian region are people who still live a self-sufficient agricultural economy. And of course, we can't just go back to that, but somehow we need to make it modern in a good way and make it current and relevant to people's lives. And I think farms as educational stages can help with that.
I think you're absolutely right. A chum of mine many years ago bought an island in the Summer Isles called Tenera. And as I'm sure you know, Tenera was the island that Frank Fraser Darling went to experiment with sustainability. And he did an incredible job there, to the point that he had proved entirely to his satisfaction that a farming livelihood without animals was really difficult, because you needed the manures and stuff created by the animals to mix with everything else to create the compost you needed to return fertility to the rest of the land. And I read this book, The Island Life, I think it's called, before, and funny enough, I was going to go up and have a look at the restoration, but Fraser Darling, who was a name I knew from my early days of anthropology, never actually met or anything, but he actually...
I can't believe you're saying this. Fraser Darling went to Glendale, where my brother still is, because he runs Sky Weavers there. And he wrote a report about the Glendale estate, because the Glendale estate was one of the first communities that took over the land from the laird.
Wow.
There were 147 crofts in Glendale, and he went I think it's recorded in his book, but I've got the essay he wrote after he'd been to Glendale, describing it as the potential of the estate to be much more self-sufficient, using livestock, recreating a crofting type system, but bringing it up to date. So isn't that fascinating that his experiment on the Summer Isles is relevant to his whole book, because he wrote that book. What's it called? I think it was just called The Highlands and Islands, published in maybe the 60s or the 60s, probably.
I think late 60s or early 60s. I can't recall, but really, really interesting stuff. And that leads you to another part of the conversation, which is fascinating, which is, you will have heard of Maya Hoffman, the
I know
heiress. Her. Well,
Yeah.
when she encouraged the creation of the Atelier Luma in Arles, it was about the sort of thing you're talking about, but actually in spades. What they were looking at, for those who do not know it, so that I mean, we're doing a podcast so other people can go and follow it up. The Atelier Luma was built alongside the marvelous art gallery she has built to house her incredible collection. But the idea behind the Atelier, obviously the French translation, the English translation is studio, was to do an audit of within 30 miles of Hull of all the ingredients, the audit of materials that mined, grown, or whatever, to act as a palette, to revisit, to see whether modern technology could give the kiss of life to a whole bunch of things that had died the death because they became uneconomic. And when you go to the art gallery, it's predominantly built of materials that have been reimagined, whether it be, obviously it wouldn't work in Cornwall, but wool is made of salt by the people who used to collect salt for the chemical industry. But now they've discovered that by allowing salt to dry on net, like fishing net, and then continuously dunking it, drying it, dunking it, drying it, you create these amazing wool coverings and so on. But there must be over 150 materials described in that. And something that you and I are both aware of is that one of the real breaks in an agronomic revolution is strangely the inability of those who have government policy at their fingertips, or indeed who do capital financing, to understand the potential economy of an agriculture that has been opened up by having some manufacturing strategically placed to be able to enable a mixed agriculture to develop. Things that you and I have both talked about have been the crops ranging from miscanthus to hemp to, the linen crops. That actually linen, for example, is really interesting. There's some people at a farm in Northern Ireland called Malin Farm who supply linen to the House of Hackney. They started with 5 acres, of linseed flax, and they weren't making a full living. They knew, though, that the fibers of flax were better than any other crop in the world of that type. Just like people who grow hemp know that the fibers of hemp, the seeds of hemp, and the corten, that's the hard bit in the middle of hemp, are incredibly valuable things. But there is only one factory in the whole of the UK that actually processes hemp. There isn't a factory in the whole of Northern Ireland that does linen anymore. And the reason is the cost of removing what they call the dust. As you know, for listeners who don't, the way you process both hemp and flax is to do what's called retting, where you wet it and allow the fibrous stuff on the side to rot off, and then you clean the dust, which is the euphemism for the dirt, off the fibers, leaving these really long fibers that can be up to 2 meters long, really strong, to be used. Anyway, this wacko guy turns up at Malin Farms. He says, I think I can help you. And he was a sound engineer from Queen's University, Belfast, who said, I want to show you something. And they put their retting flax in a tank. And he put these super woofers, bass speakers, on the tank, metal tank, and started playing bass waves through it. And the dirt fell like rain off the fibers, leaving in under an hour. All of this linen, all the flax, was completely clean. In fact, cleaner than you've ever seen it.
Would that be scaled economically, do you think?
Yeah. If there was a factory in Cornwall or Devon, if each county or each group of counties had one, the cost of transport would be hugely reduced and there would be an economy because each farm could grow 5 acres and it would protect them against failure of one crop or another.
Yeah, but as you'll agree, well, there's so much, you've covered too much already, but I just want to, before I come to that, Maya Hoffman, let's send her a copy of this podcast because she, as you know, has been a pioneer of organic farming on her own land down near Arles, and absolutely a fellow traveller. I spent some time with her at Esselen on the west coast a couple of years ago, so I know Maya quite well. And she is a marvelous visionary and leader, and she could help with all this stuff that we're talking about. But back to flax. you'll know this, that I think it's nearly 90% of all the clothing that everyone wears in the world is oil-based. There's wool, for which you hardly get the cost of shearing even now,
Yeah.
if you're a sheep farmer. There is flax, there is hemp, there are other materials, cotton obviously, that could be scaled, especially if we believed in keeping our clothes and mending them rather than just throwing them away. And we could wean ourselves off our umbilical dependency on fossil fuels for our clothing. And so what you're describing is really important, but I suspect a critic would say, you mentioned saving transport costs, but the problem is that the current cost of energy is so cheap that it would mean that a local flax system will not be able to compete economically with a centralized oil-based system. And the question is what we do about that, because governments aren't about to make the polluter pay, are they? So this goes back to food and farming, where there is a massive discrepancy, too large a discrepancy, in the price of biologically raised, organically raised food compared to its conventional counterpart. And how are we going to manage to create an economy, the next economy, as Doug Tompkins called it, the famous conservationist, where the price, the true price of food, which is hopefully what we need, the future we need to step into, is within reach of food produced from extractive chemical farming systems which are destroying the planet. And I think that is one of the big challenges, and it applies equally to clothing as it does to food. Discuss.
Absolutely. Well, I hate to keep quoting books, but one of my favorite books of the last 20 years was written by a chap who holidayed in Cornwall called James Ferguson, with 2 S's, and it was called The Vitamin Murders. It's an extraordinary book because it describes the murder of Sir Jack, I've forgotten his surname. It's the most famous murder in the 20th century in France. And Sir Jack and his wife were shot next to his Jaguar, near a Rhone-Poulenc fertilizer plant. And James uses the book to find out who might have done it. And in it, there are some really interesting things that I didn't know, but I'm sure you do. Did you know, this is for the listener, that up until, I think, 1963, don't quote me on the date, but it's roughly 1963, Boots the chemist and ICI were overseen not by the stock market, but by the Ministry of Defense. They were seen, because they produced ammonia and chlorine, they were seen as vital ingredients to a potential Soviet threat, and that they must be seen as being potentially used against the Russians should they wish to invade the rest of Europe and starve us to death. Did you know that?
Did not know that. You're so gloriously in the field, Tim. That's the difference between us. I just on boring tracks, and you just, you jump off into things and make them all connect up.
Well,
I'm in awe.
well,
I'm in awe
well,
of
no,
you.
don't be in awe. You will notice that over the last week or so, some very interesting news reports have come out. After 40 years of trying, and the Environment Agency being quite criminally publicly silent about it, about forever chemicals. Even the Royal Society has been shamefully quiet about it, and this is an authority that I have set great store by. But, Robert Hooke, who started the Royal Society, would turn in his damned grave if he knew how political and craven many of these supposedly independent institutions that were set up to defend intellect and freedom have become.
I think you are right that all these institutions become a bit fossilized, don't they? And they shouldn't be, because it's really important that we should have, explore new frontiers in science, but in an open way, not in a boring, conventional way. So that it's great that you're mentioning them.
But you know as well as I do that even you and me, there are moments when you look in the mirror and you wonder what the heck is the right thing to say and do. Because if I say what I actually believe, it could actually set I'm cutting your nose off to spite your face.
Well, I know that all the time, and I've been having various forms of anger management therapy, not really, but metaphorically speaking, to try to stop myself saying things which get me into trouble. But I'm now slightly in the last chance parade saloon and thinking,
I know.
I'm just saying what I think now.
No, well, that's absolutely right. So if we were to say what we think, you would actually say, what the hell is the so-called establishment doing, claiming it doesn't have laws that can enforce things, and we are allowing people, for reasons of business and commercial advancement, to sterilize the resources that belong to all humankind. That should be associated with the word treason. That is not an anti-capital statement. Capitalism is actually a great system for agglomerating capital to create things for the common good and the private good. But what on earth makes people square off the idea that don't get in the way of business, you're going to stop growth?
Let's explore forever chemicals, because this is really very current and very, very alarming. And I'm not sure what this span of forever chemicals is, but it definitely includes not just fire retardants and all those things which are making us all infertile and probably giving us cancer, but it also includes, I suspect, quite a lot of pesticide residues and chemicals which are used in one way or another in farming, and they are making us all sick. I would say we're in the second generation of a massive feeding trial which spans the entire Western world, which consists of feeding people with food of an inferior nutritional quality, which is also laced with forever chemicals,
Yep.
and see what happens. And we can see what is happening. Not only are people looking very unwell, which is unsurprising because most of the food that most people eat isn't really very nutritious, but also these forever chemicals are causing us to get sick both physically and mentally. And I think it's really important that we have a very public discussion about this, because it is an emergency.
Yes, and we won't. When you know that the Royal Society, for example, effectively silenced a study on it, when you know that only 200 chemicals were tested and none of them were tested in a cocktail with each other, no one knows the degree of either enhancement or dilution caused by chemical cocktails. And at the moment, there are something like 80,000 chemicals that are on the list of chemicals that are in products, and there's something like 300,000 that are available in one form or another. What madness is it that says in established institutions, if we start to look at this, our funding may drop off from people like that?
Yeah,
You shouldn't be worried about that. You should be actually thinking about, how can you arrest all these bastards who are poisoning our future generations?
yes, or maybe being slightly more constructive than that. I mean, not that that isn't a
Well, I
we
forgot this is public, isn't it, what we're saying now? God, don't no, this is not just two mates.
just could we go to the Royal Society and initiate a discussion about this, because we desperately need to stop poisoning ourselves, which is what is actually happening. You know, it's going to be a Gaian catastrophe, which is self-induced, isn't it, if we carry on like this, because people are going to die younger. Do you know about, feeding trials? There's a very interesting feeding trial which is totally unscientific, which has been going on at Ballymaloe Cookery School. You brought that up earlier. So Dorina says that she has 3 times a year around 60 plus students coming from all over the world to do their 12-week cookery course.
Yeah.
At the beginning of which, more than 50% are reporting food allergies and intolerances.
Yes.
During the 12-week course, they eat mainly organic food, which is prepared without any horrible additives and stuff, and it's all fermented and everything good at the cookery school. And at the end of those 12 weeks, apparently virtually all of the people who had these intolerances don't have them any longer, with the exception of celiacs. And the sad thing is, we're not doing anything like that, where we're feeding good food to people without any forever chemicals in it and no other stuff either, and looking at the health outcomes. And this is a really serious issue. And yet, even now, the scientific community is in denial about the importance of this.
It's crazy that we have allowed our defensiveness about our particular favored political system to trump our morals. And I find that really disturbing, that so many decisions are made where the morals get overrun by a perception that the argument is antipathetic to capitalism. And I find that really worrying, because I am myself a capitalist by instinct, and I love the fact that by agglomerating wealth, you can make things possible that would not be possible for one person. And therefore, the only issue really is, how do you write the right words that give the freedom to be entrepreneurial and the policing to make sure that your entrepreneurism doesn't affect your fellow human being negatively.
Well, I've got a couple of thoughts about that. I think you're right that the challenge we have at the moment is, assuming or not, you don't want to completely overturn capitalism. The first step would be to make it honest, because at the moment we have dishonest capitalism because we're not valuing the balance sheet of nature, natural and social capital in our calculations. And we explored this in our report called The Hidden Costs of UK Food back in I think it's 2017, we published that first, where we looked at how if you apportioned the true cost of the food that most people are eating on a supermarket shelf, it would be double what it is, because it doesn't include the damage to the environment and the damage to public health, and virtually 50-50.
Yep.
If we could get that right, that would be a start, wouldn't it?
And you know what? It's really easy. It's so easy to get it right.
And it's easier, is it? Because if you made the polluter pay, that would sort it out. But governments don't want to make the polluter pay, because not making the polluter pay keeps food cheap.
That is true. But you know, the change that you could make that would change all of this is a lateral change. A very good friend of mine, the late Stephen Lloyd, who was, I think you may have known, he was the senior partner at Bate Wells Braithwaite, the law firm that does basically pioneer the community interest company, amongst other things. But Stephen Lloyd and I agreed on many things, but one of the things we both discovered, to our astonishment, we agreed on was, what on earth are we doing allowing people to form a limited liability company in which they are protected from liabilities and we, the public, are not? Yes, there are laws to prohibit certain types of behavior and health and safety regulations, all the rest of it. However, if you were to insist that every limited liability company had to give one golden share to the nation, which meant that auditors had to audit that golden share in terms of the country's expense to the nation and its profit and loss account, that would do everything you're talking about.
But what you're essentially saying is that because we didn't include natural and social capital on the balance sheet of all companies, the auditors are signing off dishonest capitalism. So what about if we went to the big four as they're called, the big four auditors, and said, what are you going to do from now on to put nature and social capital back into the balance sheet? And I'm mentioning this because I've just been in Spain this week, in Barcelona actually, at a conference organized by S&P, the S&P 500, these huge company. And one of the people there I met and had dinner with, he is just talking about launching a new company which is doing exactly that. In other words, its balance sheet and its P&L is going to include natural and social capital. And he thinks that that's the only way we're going to counter the extractive chapter of which we have both been part.
To circle it back a bit, I was telling you about James Ferguson's book, The Vitamin Murders. James, in around 2000, had himself tested at great expense for the chemicals that were still in his body, which is exactly what that journalist just did for Panorama, but he did it 25 years ago. And he had chemicals, really noticeable amounts of chemicals, that had been banned from about the middle 1950s. And they were in his system. There was residual damage in his system. And his book, I mean, bear in mind that James, was a friend of the establishment in spades. How is it possible that no one is outraged by this, or they feel powerless? So we've now gone 25 years further down. You have that lady journalist whose name I can't for the moment recall, but will, who was on Panorama, in a state of real...
This week's Panorama, is it?
This week's Panorama.
Right, I watched that.
And she was really, really anxious about what was going to happen to her body, because the level of loading was so high and the level of microplastics in her body was so high. And yet the problem is it becomes this week's shock horror probe, and then next week Donald Trump will do something and it'll be off the front pages and it's gone. And that's what tends to happen. There is a series of papers from the Royal Society, which is like greatest hits, reports that were written that nobody listened to. And just about everything we're complaining about all the time, there will be a report, and it has been ignored by a minister.
I don't know how much more time you've got. I don't even know how long we've been going on. It's quite a while, isn't it? But I think we should possibly we agreed a long time ago that we would somehow discuss something personal. I thought we could talk about, you mentioned Charlotte right at the beginning of this discussion. I met Charlotte in, I think it was the 80s, late 80s. Peter Seger, who you also know, and
Yeah.
I went to a conference at Askham Bryan Agricultural College, organized by an organization called Rural, the Society of the Rural Use of Resources in Agriculture on the Land, organized by a man called Sir John Quick, who's a Devon, whose daughter still farms in Devon. And we went to this conference really to be troublesome, be honest, because Rural was an establishment organization which was going to get nowhere, and it was threatening the progress we were making in the organic movement. So we turned up, and there was this woman in the back row scowling, looking as if she was disgusted with what was being said at this conference. And so we went up to her and we said, "Here, who we are." And it was Charlotte Russell. And that was how we met her. And she said, she was working as a researcher for Tyne T's agriculture program.
Yeah.
Can't even remember what it was called. She said, "Oh, we should come to Wales and make a program about you and Peter," which she did. And so I've got a photograph of her when she came to the farm, which was whenever it was, whatever year it was. And subsequently, we became better acquainted. And when the Soil Association moved to Colston Street in Colston, the man whose statue is at the bottom of Bristol Harbour now, no, I think it's been resurrected, but it was thrown into the harbour in November 1985. So definitely was before that. So it must have been 83, I'm guessing, I met Charlotte. She then became the first employee of BOF OGA, British Organic Farmers and the Organic Growers Association, the two organic organizations that we set up, Peter and myself, in the early 80s. She became our first employee. Now, I don't know how much of that you knew, or she even told you, because it's quite interesting how there are chapters of one's partner's history that they don't necessarily share with you.
Well, I don't know why. That wasn't shared, but it is certainly true, dear listener, that whenever Patrick phones our house and Charlotte picks up the phone, she looks like a cat being stroked. So it's a good advertisement for the sort of employer you were, and it's good. She's as fiery today as she was then, which I think is a tremendous attribute of someone to keep honest to what you believe in. Like you, she would admit to falling off the high pinnacles from time to time, but by and large, she is very unforgiving of especially blokes who are lazy with their language and argue as only blokes can. I think it is a blokey thing about this is going to change the world when no one thing ever will. But I'm delighted, we got married, as you know, you were there 18 months ago. I think maybe, I cannot say other than I cannot recall a time I have ever been as happy as I am today.
How lovely that is to hear, and how special that, I mean, we were well connected before you married Charlotte, but we're even more closely connected now. And I'm rather excited that out of this conversation could come several new initiatives which will bind us together into the future.
Well, I love your optimism that at the age of, in my case, 71, there is still a burning horizon for us to aim at, which is tremendously optimistic. So you're actually a latter-day Nick Grimshaw, aren't you? You're dealing in hope here, Patrick. We love it.
Well, I do feel hopeful. And so we're both old men in our 70s. I'm 75. I don't feel that age is a barrier to what makes me feel excited about the future at all. I don't know why, because obviously it is a fact that, and I am more aware of this, that life is finite and that we are inevitably moving on the conveyor belt towards the end of life, at which point we'll drop off and merge into the carbon with forever chemicals. But I do feel very, very motivated. And I do feel also that coming from the 60s generation, which you sort of did just about, because you were a late arrival, you weren't at the Isle of Wight Festival, I was, that there is a
point
feeling...
scoring.
That's all I can do. You got the money from the Millennium Commission. I was at the Isle of Wight Festival. What have I got left?
Well, to be honest, you've got a long and happy future, a clean conscience. What more do you want? No, all good. And I look forward to us having some adventures. I'd like to end my part of the contribution by talking about age. One of the things that is extraordinary that I was reading about age and it not being about your body, it's about your mind. And that people start aging from the age of 19. And I went a few years to, I think something you've done, the Do lectures in Carmarthen. What? Cardigan, that's right, Cardigan, yeah. And I gave a speech. They put two people, for those of you who've not been, they put 2 or 3 people on a stage to do a kind of TED lecture for, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes. But you're all on stage together and it's sort of quite convivial. And they got this guy on stage, American psychologist, who's apparently really well known. I've just forgotten what he was called. And he was talking about aging. And he said, I can only talk to you in terms of people we would all recognize. So by very nature, I've got to mention people who are famous. But he mentioned Mandela, and he mentioned Clinton, and he mentioned, I can't remember who else he was mentioning, but they were all people we'd heard of. And he said, these are young-brained people. They're people who do not age. And he said, but look at these people. And they were like 19, 20. And he said, look at what's happening in their brains. And it's really weird that about the word conservative with a small c, it is really interesting how when you read like these potboiler books, like there's a wonderful book by Rory Sutherland called Alchemy, which came out last year, which is about lateral thought. And most of the things that we need to do to create a better world are actually surprisingly close at hand. But the breaks are so often caused by people who refuse to break, spelt differently, with something they've always felt. And we all hold on to ideas from the past. And I think every so often one needs to ask yourself a question. And that question is the best question that I have ever framed. What do you strongly and passionately believe in that you know nothing about?
Yes, that's a beautiful question because it brings us right into the present, which is all we will ever have. So, Tim, I've loved this. I feel very privileged to have had this conversation with you. You're a dear friend, and I thank you for all you brought into the world. And let's stay in front of that question. Thank you for being my podcast guest.
The pleasure was all mine.